morning.
Morning.
This morning we will be in Hebrews chapter 11 and 12. If you will open up there. Hebrews chapter 11 is where we will begin. In this chapter, which you are probably familiar with in the first place, is a list of characters from the Old Testament that are examples of faith to all people, whether they had been under the old or into the new. But looking at all of these examples, the author of Hebrews is going to, at the end of this chapter, tie all of these things together and sort of ask, what do we do in response after having seen these examples of faith? And so we're going to work our way through this text. A lot of times we wait till the end to make a lot of application. In this case, we're going to kind of spread it throughout the lesson, but we're going to start by looking at not the entire list of characters because we've run out of time, but starting with verse 30 of Hebrews chapter 11. I said 30, verse 32. 32. And what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, and on and on. And the point is made by the author himself. I don't even have time to tell you of all of the wonderful examples that we see just in the Old Testament of faith. And so we point back to the Old Testament and we remember those stories and we love those stories for good reason. Partly because, like Paul says in Romans chapter 15, verse 4, that we learn from those things which were written before. But it's not just that we learn from them, but we can identify pretty easily with characters, maybe more so than laws and commands that are given. So we look back to these people and we say, that's something I've experienced. Or they lived a life that maybe is a similar way to the way in which I've lived. And a lot of times they have failed God in a way that is also reminiscent of the failure that I have. But their faith paves the way for Christ. Now that's really meant in two senses. One, God's plan involves the faith of these people over thousands of years leading into Christ in some general spiritual sense. But even more so, Christ cannot be part of the plan without the faith of Abraham. Christ cannot be part of God's plan without the faith of David and Rahab. He never gets into this world without those people of faith coming first. And so they are this lineage of faith looking from the old into the new and coming straight through Christ. And so this is the group that we're trying to look at this morning. And the one other thing that the author here says in verse 38 is that of this group, the world was not worthy. So the world itself, those who were not part of this collective group of faith, they weren't worthy to interact with those who were part of it. And again, you can kind of take that in a general sense, but you can also take that more literally. Was Pharaoh worthy of interacting with Moses? Not because Moses is so righteous and wonderful by himself, but because Moses is so devoutly obedient to God, and Pharaoh is the opposite. And the same thing is true for Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar, or whichever pair you want to take. These people weren't worthy of them, and these are the same people that ended up a lot of times either harassing or eventually killing them. So when these people, and again, you can go through the entirety of chapter 11 here, but when they're summarized at the end of chapter 11, starting verse 39, it says this of this whole group of faithful people. 39. And all these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise, God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. Okay, let's start with the good testimony. Every one of these people in the 11th chapter of Hebrews is known for different things. Most of them, though, are known as great leaders of the people of Israel, or they're known as the heads of household of what would eventually become great and powerful families and nations, or they're prophets of God, or they're some other renowned title. But even more so, they do serve as these examples of faithfulness. But either way, these people are held up as being so great and so faithful to God, and yet the very next line says, and they did not receive the promise. Well, that seems strange. They're so faithful to God, but they didn't receive the promise. Okay, well, here's the other question. What promise is it that we're talking about? Actually, back in verse 33 of chapter 11, one of the items mentioned is that they obtained promises, and then stop the mouths of lions at the end of that verse. So they did receive various promises. You think back to David, for example. He's promised that there will always be a man on the throne of his own family. That's a promise. You can think all the way back to Abraham, that all nations would be blessed through his descendants, but also that he would have descendants that would number like the sands of the sea. And so these promises are there throughout the Old Testament, but what promise in particular are we talking about here? I think it's maybe twofold. In the book of Hebrews, there's already been one promise in view that was not fulfilled. So you go back to chapters 3 and 4, chapter 3, 19 specifically, and it talks about the rest that was provided or would be provided. It says in chapter 3, verse 18, and to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest, but those who did not obey? So we see that they could not enter because of unbelief. And again, this theme will continue into the next chapter there as well. That those who were unfaithful to God did not inherit the rest that was promised. Usually that's understood to be the promised land, especially that generation that died in the wilderness. They didn't inherit that. But in a broader sense, they didn't inherit heaven itself, at least not at the time of their death. And that's a whole separate issue to address. But while it's true that that promise was maybe not fulfilled directly for those who were faithful under the Old Testament, what it really amounts to is that the promise was from chapter 11, verse 40, that God would provide something better for us. So what is the better promise that comes along that was not available to those under the Old Testament? Of course, that's the person of Christ. And so those under the Old Testament, they were faithful to God. They did things that were righteous. They acted in ways that were pleasing to God, but ultimately they did not receive the promise that would come later on. The promise of Christ, and by extension, the reward of Christ. Now that being said, in verse 40, the rest of it says that they should not be made perfect apart from us. So let's clarify that we're not trying to put the faithful saints of the Old Testament in a category of no reward and apart from Christ forever, but just saying that they wouldn't receive that before we do. That they wouldn't be made perfect or complete apart from us. But they will be made perfect, all those who are faithful. Just to emphasize that point, in chapter 12, skip down to verse 22. Hebrews 12:22, it says, but you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels, that's one group, to the general assembly, and the church of the firstborn. We have a few different groups there. Angels we expect to be in heaven, but also the general assembly. That is everyone else that we think we can include even these Old Testament faithful characters in, and on top of that group, the church. Those under the New Testament who are faithful. But it says of all of these that they are registered in heaven to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of the just men made perfect. And so it's not that these Old Testament saints are without hope. They have the same reward. It just, they wouldn't receive it as they died. They would receive it alongside us, which is fair enough. And God has the right to choose how he will reward and when he will reward as well. But that's the group that we're talking about. It's this list of people of the Old Testament, and it's a list that even the author himself says, I don't have enough time to mention everybody by name. But every person from that Old Testament time period that was faithful, this is a group that now interacts with Christians. How does that happen? because every one of these people has been dead at this point for 2,000 plus years. So how do we interact with them still today? Well, partially by what we've talked about already, that their faith sets an example for our faith, but it gets a little bit more direct than that when we get into chapter 12. In Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, it says, "Therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses." Well, who's that? It's the same people we've been talking about for the last several minutes, the Old Testament faithful. It says, "Let us lay aside every weight and sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and the finisher of our faith, who, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God." So we have surrounding us, according to the author here, a cloud of witnesses. That is a group of people, but specifically witnesses, which we'll address in a second. But there appears to be in this text an allusion to a specific event in the ancient world, or series of events. And so people have thought this for a long time, and it makes quite a bit of sense. When he's talking about a race here, we don't do a lot of racing today. You do in the school system, on high school level, college level. But of course, in the next couple of weeks, we're coming up on a particular international event of the Olympics. Well, the Olympics is a very ancient event. In fact, it's probably some 700 years before Christ was ever on the earth and before Hebrews was written. That being said, what does that have to do with the book of Hebrews being written to a bunch of Jews scattered across the ancient Mediterranean world? Well, the Jews may be more familiar with this than we give them credit for. Because the Olympics, this is just a little bit of history that ties in here, the Olympics had fallen out of favor, out of prominence, when the Greek Empire is conquered by the Roman. They don't keep it up quite the same way. They still have it a lot of the time, but it's not as impressive as it once was. But then one man came along, and partially probably just seeking to please other people, partially making a name for himself, he revives the Olympic Games in earnest. And that happens right about the time that Christ is born, because the individual that's responsible for reviving the games is Herod the Great, the same one that tries to kill Christ as an infant. But it's him and his renown for construction, for improving the temple, for all the things that he does. He also makes the Olympic Games a lot of what they were before. And so the ruler of the Jewish area is the one that's setting this up. And so when we come to this and we see a race that's being set before us, it's probably not some arbitrary concept of racing, but maybe one that the Jews are a little bit more familiar with, and by extension, because we still practice the Olympics today, that we have a little bit of familiarity with as well. And so that sets the scene, though, of this great multitude of people watching a race. So this is a cloud of witnesses, they are called. And witness can mean two things. Witness can mean, on the one hand, that you are an observer of something. Number two, witness can mean that you have already observed something and you're giving a testimony about what you have seen. And in this case, it's really both. What the author's saying is that we're surrounded as we race by this group of people who, one, are watching us. That's fair enough. They watch us as we go along, but even more so, they can give testimony. Because in the next couple of weeks, when we start to watch the Olympics, most of us, if we were to go out onto the track, would be humiliated by comparison to anyone that is running. But in this case, it's a little different. Every one of this cloud of witnesses already ran the race. Every one of them has already finished it, and they did so faithfully. Every person in the audience that's watching knows exactly what it's like to be on that track, to compete in the same way that we are right now. So we're surrounded by not just observers, but by peers, people who have been there already. The group that we're talking about here have participated in millennia at this point of faithfulness. I think it's fair to say that this is written as the New Testament opens, but we can add to this group of faithful people everyone that has come along since the time that this was written as well. So not just those of the Old Testament who were faithful, but perhaps our own family members who have passed on. And 1,000, 2,000 years of Christians since the time that this letter was written also. The encouragement that's given here is, if this is the case, then what can we do? What should we do as runners in this race? Well, we should lay aside every weight and sin. And so it is possible for us to run. It's possible for anybody to run while being weighed down. But going back to the Olympics, if you take the fastest person on earth and you give them a backpack with 4 or 5 bowling balls in it, they will not win any race. They will finish the race, probably, but they won't win. So what's the difference in these weights and these sins that we keep hanging around? Well, all it can do is slow our progress. All it can do is make it harder on us, make us waste energy, make us waste effort, when we could be better focused on getting to the finish line and better focused on helping others to come along in the race with us. The other thing that is pointed out here is not just to look at the audience, not just to look at those around, but also to look at the end goal and the one person who has also set the example for everyone else. Looking unto Jesus in verse 2, the author and the finisher of our faith. And it goes into the description that he has already gone through this process and knows better than anyone else what it's like to go through the race, enduring the cross, but now having sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. He is the pattern because he was in the race. The race was kind of cut short for him, but it didn't matter because he still obtained the reward of being at the right hand of God. The phrase that's used here describing Jesus as the author and the finisher of our faith, your translation may say something a little bit different there, originator. There's a few different words that get put in those places. But it's a fascinating phrase because when we see author there, or whatever your translation says, what that means or where that comes from is a phrase that means to take the lead. And so if we're talking about this in terms of a race, then what is the author telling us? He says that you look unto Christ. Why? Because he has taken the lead in the race, but he's also the perfecter or the finisher of the faith. So he's taken the lead, but he also, in the same fashion, is the one who has completed. And so Christ is, as we already know, the beginning and the end, the first and the last, but here it appears to be quite literal. In the race of faith, Christ was the first to finish, but he's also going to be the last to complete. He's going to be there as the first person crosses the finish line, but he's also there for the last straggler that is coming across at the very last moment. Christ is there at the beginning of the race. He's there at the end. He's there all the way through. He was there when these faithful people made their crossing of the finish line. He will be there when we do as well. He's the author and the finisher of this faith. So what do we do with this knowledge of how this race is run and this group of people that's there essentially cheering us on, saying, you can do this because we've done this too? Hopefully it helps us to change maybe our understanding of faith, but at least it should help us to change our attitude toward faith. When we look at the world around us, there is temptation, and there is reason, but there's a lot of temptation to say, well, things don't look great. And a lot of times they don't, sure, from an earthly perspective. And so it's very tempting for us to have a negative attitude of this race that we run. And it turns into more of a rat race, or maybe to use a whole different illustration, we start to fear, and we start to fear that maybe that roaring lion that Peter tells us about, well, maybe he's having a little bit too much success. And this race isn't really a race, but it's a chase. And all we're waiting for is for the lion to pick off the next gazelle that's just a little bit too slow in the race. And we're afraid on a personal level, an individual level. We think, well, maybe I haven't done quite enough, and maybe I'm not faithful enough, and maybe after my next mistake, Christ won't continue on in the race with me. Well, that's certainly a negative view. On the other side of this, we look at the world, like I said, and we start to think, well, our nation is just so derailed from where it needs to be, and things are so different from when I was young, and the kids these days will have to face things so difficult, and all that's true, and that's fair, but if all of my idea of how faith works and how I'm going to finish the race is based on me, then of course I'm going to be scared the whole time. And of course I'm going to just be waiting for the next bad thing to happen, thinking, well, how am I ever going to make it to the end of this? What's the other perspective? What is the better promise that's been given? The situation that we've shown this morning. That when you run the race of Christianity, you are not alone. Number one, you run alongside every other Christian who's running with you. Everyone else who's dedicated to the exact same cause that you are and the same goal of reaching the same finish line. Number two, you're also surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. So massive and innumerable a group of people who have been faithful to God for centuries, who are saying, we have been there. We know exactly what it's like. We know the challenges that have been faced. Some of us were put to death for our belief. But you can do this too. You can be faithful just as we were. And we look, number three, to Christ, and we say, well, Christ has already been through this. He was there at the beginning. He'll be there through the end. What do I have to fear? Surrounded by fellow Christians, surrounded by everyone who's ever been faithful and running toward Christ. Why can I not lay aside all of the other things, the sins, the fears, everything that weighs me down? This morning, I hope this has been a helpful look at this text in Hebrews 11, chapter 12. But I hope it helps us to recognize the reality of the situation. We spend a lot of time thinking about the physical reality of where we live and the state of our nation, the things going on around us, but what is the spiritual reality of where we're at? For each of us, we're running a race. Some of us are very close to the finish line. Some of us are very far from the finish line. Some of us maybe think that we're farther, but we don't know how long our race will be individually. But what we do know is that Christ is there, that fellow Christians are there, and there's a group of people cheering us on who have already been through all of this. This morning you have an opportunity to run this race with confidence, with hope, without fear, putting all those things aside. You also have an opportunity to start your race. Maybe it's that you've never become a child of God. Maybe you were a child of God, but you have fallen away entirely. Or maybe you just need some help from those who are running alongside you. But this morning, if there's anything we can do, we ask that you come forward now as we stand, as we sing. What man was